Throughout the Tudor period, there were many crazy stories of Henry VIII trying to marry off his children to solidify alliances. There were even talks at the time of Mary I, Henry VIII's eldest daughter, marrying the illegitimate son of the king, technically her half-sibling, to strengthen this son's claim to the throne. Henry Fitzroy was the illegitimate son in question, and he was shrouded in titles to the point where many historians have believed that he would have become king if he were to have lived longer, and if Edward VI, the king's legitimate son, would have never been born. But Henry Fitzroy, the illegitimate son of Henry VIII, did marry despite being just a child. He married a young girl who was very close to Anne Boleyn's family. But who was Mary Howard, the forgotten daughter-in-law of Henry VIII? Lady Mary Howard was the second daughter of Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, the incredibly ambitious uncle of two of Henry's wives, including Anne Boleyn, his second wife. When she was born, her father was the second most senior noble in England, and her maternal grandfather, Edward Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, was the more powerful. But following Buckingham's execution, her father was only one of two dukes in England, but this changed when, in 1535, Henry VIII elevated his 6-year-old illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, to the peerage, and he became known as the Duke of Richmond and Somerset. Fitzroy had been born to the king through an affair with his royal mistress, Bessie Blount, and the king, shockingly, shrouded his son with many riches, despite the fact he was illegitimate. For the king, it showed that he could produce a son, and he wanted to celebrate. But in 1529, the man who was supposed to be looking after Fitzroy, Cardinal Wolsey, fell from grace, and then Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, seized control of his upbringing. Around this time, the idea was then debated that the king's illegitimate son should marry Howard's daughter Mary. It's not known whether the king came up with this or whether Anne Boleyn did to strengthen her links to royalty, but the idea was accepted, and 4 years later the negotiations for Fitzroy to marry Mary Howard were completed. The pair were aged 13 and 14, and they were married. Mary would become a first cousin to Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the king's executed fifth wife, and also a second cousin to his third wife, Jane Seymour. But the Boleyns greatly celebrated the march and the marriage, and as the Duchess Mary was a former member of Anne Boleyn's household, the Duke was also seen as a possible king at the time, meaning that Mary Howard could have easily become the Queen of England following the death of Henry VIII. The king was worried about a number of things, and he told the couple not to consummate their marriage. But Mary Howard was not, following the death of her husband, allowed to keep much of the lands she would have, as without the consummation of the marriage it was said to have not been a true marriage. Henry Fitzroy, the great hope for Henry VIII, and the husband of Mary Howard, died on the 23rd of July 1536 after suffering from what many believe was tuberculosis, which caused severe problems with his lungs. His body was later buried and interred aside of a chest in Framlingham Church in Suffolk, but with his death, Mary Howard, despite being young, was now a widow. But Mary Howard remained at court, and she began to write and script poetry with others at court. She was also then tasked with meeting Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of Henry, in Calais before she came to England. However, worry would come on the horizon for Mary, as when Henry VIII married Catherine Howard, his fifth wife, she would come crashing down sharply following accusations of adultery. She was allegedly sleeping with the king's best friend, and following the shocking crime, Mary Howard, along with the rest of the Howard family, were arrested and were then imprisoned in the Tower of London. But her father was still asking for the king for Mary to be married to Thomas Seymour, but this was given approval by the king, but there was much strong objection from Mary herself. Crazily then, attention turned to Mary Howard possibly seducing the king, Henry VIII. Her brother Henry suggested that she should sleep with the king and become his mistress to gain more power and favour, but Mary claimed that she would rather cut her own throat than consent to such villainy. With this, she fell out with her brother, and she later testified against him, which resulted in her own brother's execution. However, Mary Howard never remarried. And following the death of King Henry VIII, her influence and power at court dwindled, and she became a relative nobody. She would die in late 1557 during the reign of her half-sister-in-law, Queen Mary I. But she was a woman who was very devoted to learning and reform. But she was also a woman who was true to herself. When others sought to claim more power through Mary, she stood up for herself, showing that she was a headstrong and brilliant woman. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.